if you say something like the sky is blue and Putin said the sky is blue, according to this research from this think tank in Washington, D.C., you're spreading Russian disinformation. Or whatever. That's how their methodology works.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. During the War on Terror, elites would stifle dissent by accusing their anti-war opponents of being terrorist sympathizers. In today's Cold War environment, that smear has been replaced with disinformation agent. Anyone who points out NATO's history of aggression or expresses skepticism of the US pouring billions of dollars of weapons into a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, or even lightly questions the endless stream of corporate media propaganda vilifying China, is deemed guilty of spreading disinformation on behalf of America's adversaries. Even merely highlighting the well-documented history of Western imperialism gets classified as sinister disinformation. In other words, reality itself is one big disinformation conspiracy theory if it happens to make the imperial powers look bad. Here to discuss the disinformation industry and how it's contributed to the collapse of foreign reporting in the West is Ben Norton, a Latin America-based journalist and founder of Multipolarista. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you can get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthroughnews or by donating below on YouTube. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Always glad to be here, Rania. Thanks for having me.
So I guess before we get started, we should give a moment of silence for the Queen or something. I don't know. Are we allowed to do that?
A Hitler admirer who Nazi saluted as a child has passed away. So tragic.
I mean, I thought it was interesting to see the family tree because I didn't realize how many of them were cousins. Her husband was her third cousin, and then their parents were also cousins. It's crazy. But that's not the worst of it. That's actually the least offensive
democracy and civilization to the world. Well, when not, having relations with their cousins.
Well, it sounds like, that's the perfect segue to what we're going to be talking about, because a lot of people would accuse us of spreading disinformation by saying those things. But obviously the topic that, I want to center this episode around is the issue of disinformation, but it relates to almost every other issue that we talk about on Breakthrough News and that you talk about on Multipolarista. And what I'll start by saying is, and you and I have had this conversation before, but I think you have a really good grasp and analysis of all this. So I remember back during the sort of peak of the War on Terror, those of us who were questioning the war, the drone strikes or the reasoning for this, basically global killing spree that America went on after 9/11 in the name of fighting Islamic extremism, we were always being silenced with these smears of being terrorism sympathizers. And that also went for anybody who supported Palestinian rights, right? We were constantly being accused by the Israelis and their supporters of supporting terrorism. And that was actually, at least in the beginning, a pretty successful way of shutting down dissent. Because nobody wants to be accused of being an Al-Qaeda supporter or supporting terrorism, especially because terrorism is a scary thing, right? It really made people scared to think about potential, terrorist attacks. But now that we've obviously the war on terror is still happening, but it's really not at the centerpiece of American foreign policy. Right now, we're in this Cold War with Russia and China. And so now all we hear, instead of being a terrorism sympathizer, for those of us who are maybe questioning, the role of NATO or questioning whether we should be having these escalations with nuclear armed countries and the reasoning behind it, whether it's Russia or China, we're constantly being called disinformation agents or, Russian or Chinese disinformation propagandists. And of course, this started, I think, mostly in 2016 after Trump won the election. And then rather than taking responsibility for losing, Democrats blamed supposed Russian disinformation. And it's really only snowballed since then, creating this entire industry of think tanks, many connected to the State Department and weapons companies, that accuse people like us who question that new Cold War of promoting disinformation. So all that's to say, Ben, can you talk about the significance of this dynamic? And do you think it's been successful? And I mean, break it down as you see it.
Yeah, well, we'll start at the beginning of this. I think, you're right to say that this began really in late 2016, early 2017 with the election of Trump. And the ruling class in the United States was really shocked. Everyone assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. She was leading in all the polls. And instead of acknowledging in any self-criticism, acknowledging the fact that Hillary Clinton herself ran a very right-wing campaign, defending war, defending neoliberal economic policies, the fact that Hillary Clinton was the second least popular presidential candidate in history after Trump, who was the least popular. Instead of acknowledging any of those facts, there was this convenient narrative that Russia got Trump elected, right? This gave birth to Russiagate. And we know that for a variety of reasons, certain elements of the ruling class were using this to try to distract from the problems that they helped create, the massive economic problems in the US, the de-industrialization, the loss of jobs in the Rust Belt, all of these different problems that are bipartisan. I mean, obviously, Trump was a complete charlatan. He didn't do anything to challenge deindustrialization. He didn't bring back jobs. He only, cut taxes on the rich. He oversaw the largest wealth transfer from the working class to the capitalist class in modern history. So Trump was a fraud, but he did play on some of this popular discontent and tried to use so-called populist rhetoric in a way. And when he won on this, fraudulent campaign of claiming that he was going to do these things he never did, the response was, well, we can blame Russia because that also helps, because clearly Russia is becoming this new near peer strategic competitor. As people in the Pentagon say, in 2018, the Pentagon published the new National Defense Strategy, in which it said that the new so-called enemies or threats to U.S. national security are China and Russia, no longer non-state so-called terrorism. I think that really in many ways marked the kind of end of the war on terror and the move toward this new Cold War. And Russiagate, of course, was used by the ruling class to create this popular hatred of Russia, to justify military encirclement of Russia, beefing up the proxy war in Ukraine, which began in 2014. It didn't begin on February 24th this year when Russia invaded. So anyway, we have to keep all of that context in mind in the background. And then you mentioned, Rania, that when Trump came in, there was this cottage industry that emerged of think tanks in Washington. And I think we really need to understand the revolving door between think tanks in Washington and the media to understand how these narratives are created. So what happens in a nutshell is a US government-funded think tank that also is usually funded by big corporations, the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel industry. What it does is it publishes these white papers, these research papers. It publishes like this very shady research claiming, Russian disinformation or whatever based on some bots or whatever on social media. And they make like these graphs with like clouds of like people who are like tweeting certain things that have like certain keywords, but there's no evidence showing that they're together. So if you say something like the sky is blue and Putin said the sky is blue, according to this research from this think tank in Washington, D.C., you're spreading Russian disinformation or whatever. That's how their methodology works. And then what happens is after this think tank, which has like some idea of legitimacy, it has a veneer of authority, it publishes the study. And the fact that the methodology is very bad is not relevant. What happens is that study is cited by the media, and it says that that's proof that Russian disinformation is spreading these narratives or whatever that are helping discredit NATO or something like that. And what happens is that is laundered through the media, and then there are dozens of articles in the media, and then there are establishment politicians in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, who repeat these stories in the media, and it's basically just this feedback loop that all goes back to the U.S. government itself. It's based on very shoddy research methods, and it creates this idea that there is a problem of Russian and Chinese disinformation, and you can't challenge it because every media outlet has published this. You can't challenge it because there's 10 studies in these respected think tanks, and if you dare to challenge their methodology, well, you're engaging in information war on behalf of Russia and China. This, Rania, I mean, I'm sure especially when you look at the war in Syria, a lot of this disinformation, this is how the media now works today. It's all this kind of feedback loop of think tanks funded by the government, spreading these really shady claims with no evidence, and then it's just regurgitated endlessly. And the fact that it's repeated endlessly makes it seem like it's true.
Yeah, it really is this like horrible cycle, and it works so successfully. And I'm always surprised by it because, at least with the issue of like terrorism, people were scared of something tangible. Like people feared, whether it was logical or not, there was images that you could scare people with, that you could loop on TV all day long. The Twin Towers falling, uh, a bomb going off in like a subway in London, and ISIS attacks across Europe, like with these like mass shooting attacks, and on and on and on, where you could really, people would be scared to fly, people would be scared to be in public spaces. You could like use this fear to get people to support really stupid policies that actually made it much worse. But with the issue of disinformation, I'm actually kind of amazed with how successful it is, because what does it mean? It's not physically like something that you can like tell people this is going to hurt you. This is going to, kill you and your family. You know what I mean? But you've made a really good point about the way that it's fear mongered using xenophobia. So it's not just disinformation, right? It's like Russian disinformation or Chinese disinformation. And or Iranian disinformation, or God help us, Venezuelan disinformation. Like these are the things that are supposed to strike fear into our hearts, is because we're, Americans are like indoctrinated to be like racist against all of these nationalities and to actually fear them.
Yeah, well, I think we need to understand that there's a very long history within capitalism, and of course, even before that, with the European colonialist empires, of using xenophobia to scapegoat the enemies of the empire, the enemies of the capitalist class, and try to distract average working people from their real oppressors, who are the big corporations and billionaires who are exploiting them, right? It's your bosses who are taking your wealth and cutting your paycheck. It's the corrupt oligarchs who run the government. I mean, the reality is, in the United States, there is a massive economic crisis, a massive systemic crisis of capitalism we've seen, especially since the 2008 financial crash. It was basically a jobless recovery. According to official government statistics, the unemployment rate technically hasn't been super high. But if we look at where many of the jobs actually came from, they were in precarious, positions like driving for Uber, right? Or delivering food on like an app. These are not real jobs. It's all the contractization of work. These are jobs that are very precarious, that don't have benefits. People don't have health care. People are trapped in nearly $2 trillion of student debt. Now, yeah, Biden, he did pardon 300 billion worth, but that's a tiny fraction of the $1.75 trillion of student debt. And Biden did not stop late fees. Biden did not, pardon the huge like interest rates that people are paying on this debt. So he forgave up to 10,000, and that's something good. But the reality is that the economic crises that people are suffering from in the United States are getting worse and worse by the year. So there are a few ways to respond to that. You could actually provide healthcare and education and housing for homeless people, but that's not even on the table in the United States. Or you can scapegoat immigrants. That's what Republicans do and racists do. They say that, all these immigrants from Central America are stealing our jobs, and they use these racist talking points. Or you can do what, many Democrats do, and also some neoconservative Republicans do, which is blame China and Russia, right? That these problems are not caused by the economic system in which a bunch of billionaire oligarchs are exploiting everything and getting richer while everyone's getting poorer. No, the problems are caused by these foreign boogeymen of China, Russia, and Iran, which happen to be the main competitors, as the U.S. says, or challengers to U.S. unipolar imperial hegemony, right? And so it's very convenient for the imperialists who are in Washington and who are thinking about how to run the U.S. empire. People like Antony Blinken, Victoria Nuland in the State Department. They can say these problems are not real economic problems. They're not caused by our economic policies. They're caused by the fact that China has taken our jobs. Trump did the same thing, right? Trump said, China has taken our jobs and exploited us with this, trade deficit and all of this. Or in the case of Russia, right? They say that Russia is the reason Trump got elected, not because he did this very, misleading campaign claiming that tapping into very real economic problems and then doing nothing about it, scapegoating immigrants. So this is an age-old tactic. Imperial conquerors and capitalists have used this tactic for many decades. And it's very effective because people do feel that their lives are getting worse. We see that the life expectancy in the United States continues to decline. especially with the COVID pandemic, life expectancy declined by several years, especially among Black communities, Latino communities, and indigenous communities in the United States. So people are truly feeling that their lives are getting worse. Their children are genuinely having a worse life than their parents for the first generation. And they can say, well, it's China and Russia. China's on the rise and we're on the decline. So therefore, by this strange logic, China is responsible for our decline, not our own capitalist, oligarch politicians who exploit us and refuse to give us any social programs. So, in that sense, if you looked at the so-called war on terror, there was this attack on 9/11, and people could try to scapegoat Muslims and Arabs and say, like, the problem is the Middle East, West Asia, all of these. And now we see that the problem is much, much more clear, that people are genuinely having a difficult time economically, and China and Russia on the rise. So clearly the problem is Chinese and Russian disinformation. And the way that it's always linked to China and Russia needs to be emphasized. If you look at these think tanks, the Atlantic Council, the Brookings Institution, CSIS, there are a bunch of, there's alphabet soup of all of these think tanks in Washington that are funded by the State Department, by Google, by Facebook, by Raytheon, by Lockheed Martin, by ExxonMobil. If you look at these think tanks, whenever they publish a study about so-called disinformation, almost always it's Russian disinformation and Chinese disinformation. They basically join those together. And they even they try to say it in Russian, like disinformatsiya or whatever, to make it sound like it's something unique. They never talk about the U.S. ruling class's own disinformation, WMDs. Russiagate itself was a disinformation campaign aimed against the people in the United States. Or, babies in incubators, right? The idea that the Iraqi soldiers were taking babies out of incubators in Kuwait. Or the Gulf of Tonkin incident, classic example of disinformation. None of that is ever talked about. Instead, it's always foreign disinformation.
No, that's a really good point. And I mean, sometimes they'll even just deny that something economically difficult for people is even taking place. Like, do you remember when it became clear that the economy was not doing well? And to even suggest that we might be in a recession became like disinformation. And of course, they were like, if anything's wrong, it's because of Putin's war on gas or whatever. But, Ben, you were actually targeted by the New York Times yourself. You were attacked by the New York Times as supposedly promoting conspiracy theories because you pointed out that the U.S. backed a coup in Ukraine in 2014 that helped lead to the war that we're seeing now. And I don't want to give attention to the New York Times because they suck. So I'm just going to put your article that you wrote about this on screen. But can you tell us, I mean, this is just, it's amazing because you said something that even the New York Times, this is the article, by the way, that in Multipolarista, and I'll link to it in the description, but you said, you note in the piece that the New York Times themselves have actually reported on the very US-backed coup that you were reporting on or noting when talking about the war in Ukraine, yet now they were calling you a conspiracy theorist for pointing it out. So can you explain what happened with this piece and what it says about the broader mainstream media apparatus in the US is really just like an arm of the state at this point?
Yeah, well, we've known for many decades that the New York Times has a revolving door with the US government. In fact, the New York Times itself acknowledged that when it has a story that is so-called sensitive to US national security, it will actually send it to US government officials to approve it before they publish it. And this was also reaffirmed by James Risen, who was a New York Times columnist and reporter who left the New York Times and joined The Intercept. And when he joined The Intercept, he published a very lengthy article talking about how during the Bush era in particular, but also the Obama administration, that the New York Times would send stories to national security officials to get approval, to make sure that, the US government didn't find anything objectionable in it. So the New York Times is de facto state media. I mean, it doesn't publish stories that the US government doesn't want. It's basically state media. And we can go back many decades to see the long history of the New York Times spreading disinformation. I just mentioned a few examples. WMDs. The New York Times was critical in helping to spread these fake claims from the CIA to justify the illegal invasion of Iraq. The New York Times also spread lies about the Gulf of Tonkin. And you can go back to the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the headline was like Vietnamese Reds attack U.S. ship or something like that. I mean, just blatant propaganda. More recently, we saw during the NATO war of aggression against Libya that destroyed the most prosperous country in Africa in 2011. The New York Times spread false claims claiming that, but from the U.S. government, claiming that Muammar Gaddafi was giving Viagra to his soldiers and encouraging them to assault women. Completely false. Even Amnesty International acknowledged later that that was false. There's no evidence for it. The New York Times published false claims more recently about this idea of Russian bounties, that Russia was supposedly paying bounties to the Taliban to kill the U.S. soldiers that had been occupying their country for 20 years, as if they needed monetary motivation to kill and fight against the occupiers of their country. Anyway, I could spend a lot of time talking about the New York Times' long history of spreading disinformation on behalf of the U.S. government.
Actually, do a whole episode on that. We have to do a whole episode on it because it's so much.
But getting more relevant now to this particular attack against me, I think it's an insightful example, a case study in how when the New York Times talks about disinformation, it's always Russian and Chinese disinformation, and it's often in the context of something that's actually true. It's not false. In this context, they accused me of spreading simultaneously. I don't know how I did this. I guess I'm working for both China and Russia at the same time, apparently. I mean, it's absurd. I'm not in any way. They said that I was they said that I was spreading Chinese and Russian disinformation. And how did I do that? It's because when Russia invaded Ukraine, I pointed out that, yes, Russia obviously bears some responsibility for invading Ukraine, but it was the United States that started this war back in 2014 by organizing a coup that overthrew the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. And there were far-right extremists who played a key role in that violent coup in February of 2014. And then the U.S. spent billions of dollars before Russia sent a single troop on February 24th of 2022. The U.S. sent its military officers over to Ukraine to train fighters. We know that going back to 2015, the CIA and the Pentagon were training fighters in Ukraine to wage a proxy war against Russia. A former CIA official referred to it as a counterinsurgency campaign, and he said, an insurgency campaign, and he said that the goal was to kill Russians. This was all before Russia sent a single troop in. And if you acknowledge that history, if you acknowledge the fact that Victoria Nuland, who was one of the senior officials in the State Department under Obama, she's now the third in command of the State Department under Biden. There's a leaked phone recording in which it was likely leaked by Russian intelligence, but it's a real recording. It's been proven to be true, in which this State Department official, Victoria Nuland, she can be heard speaking with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat. And in this leaked recording, she says, Yats is the guy, referring to Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who became the prime minister of Ukraine just a few weeks after the coup in February 2014. And she says that we need Yatsenyuk to be in charge. She talked about she said these other people in Ukraine, they're not, they don't have the economic experience. They're not up to what we need from them. So this is a leaked recording of this top State Department official and the ambassador deciding who the prime minister of Ukraine would be. And then a few weeks later, he becomes prime minister. This is a smoking gun example of a coup. But according to the New York Times, if you say the U.S. government organizes coups in countries like Ukraine or Chile or Bolivia or Venezuela or countless countries around the world, that's a conspiracy theory. And if you say it now, you're spreading Chinese and Russian disinformation. So, I mean, this is a clear example of something that is genuinely an objective fact, but all they need to say is it's disinformation, and then people turn their brains off. Even the term disinformation has been basically redefined to mean whatever the U.S. government doesn't like.
Yeah, whatever's like inconvenient to basically imperialist narratives. And it really is all just about controlling the narrative and suppressing dissent, because no one in their right mind wants to be accused of working for the Chinese or the Russians in this kind of like hysterically Cold War environment. So that's a really good point, is it's meant to turn your brain off. But also what's so interesting too is, like, you mentioned all the disinformation of like the New York Times, and that never gets talked about, like actual disinformation, if you want to use the word accurately. talking, and then there's like an extra layer of it where talking about imperialist crimes that we know happen becomes disinformation, right? Like talking about WMDs, talking about the coup, talking about the crimes of colonialism in some cases that are accurate and well documented becomes disinformation, whereas denying them is totally acceptable and might piss some people off. But like, it's so interesting because you have one of the biggest news networks in the country. And this is a segue into something that is relevant to like something that just happened in the last week, which was the death of the Queen. The biggest news network in the country, Fox News, and its biggest, I believe, primetime show, it has the most viewers, something like an average of like 3 to 4 million viewers a night, is Tucker Carlson. Literally, like people like us, because we oppose US intervention in Libya or Syria or in Ukraine, are literally called genocide denialists, like regularly. Like, I mean, it's at this point, like you just roll your eyes. It's like Assadist, genocide denialist, whatever. Like, it's just, that's what we get called for pushing back against like obvious mainstream BS. But this is actual genocide denial that's totally acceptable because it doesn't harm the status quo. And I think it's really worth showing because, while people like us are like, the New York Times wrote about you, Ben, and basically portrayed you as like a scary person that might be working for China, you definitely do not have the audience that Tucker Carlson has. And I really do think this is just a clip from his very long, disgusting segment. All right, I'm going to play it. Oh, he's talking obviously about the death of the Queen and British colonialism.
In the real world, the one that we live in, strong countries dominate weak countries, and that shows no sign of changing. The very least you can say about the English is that they took their colonial responsibilities seriously. They didn't just take things, they added. When the US government withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years, we left behind airstrips, shipping containers, and guns. When the British pulled out of India, they left behind an entire civilization, a language, a legal system, schools, churches, and public buildings, all of which are permanent today. Here's the train station the English built in Bombay, for example. There's nothing like that in Washington, D.C. right now, much less in Kabul or Baghdad. Today, India is far more powerful than the UK, the nation that once ruled it. And yet, after 75 years of independence, has that country produced a single building as beautiful as the Bombay train station?
Yes. Yes, many.
Yeah.
Sadly, it has not. Not one. So despite what they may be claiming on Twitter tonight, the British Empire was more than just genocide. In fact, the British did not commit genocide, except arguably against the Dutch during the Boer War. The British did give the world the Magna Carta.
Rania, you have to go back to that. This is so incredible.
What he just said?
He says the British Empire didn't commit genocide except maybe against other white people, against the Dutch.
We have to play that one more time.
It didn't commit genocide in Southern Africa. It didn't commit genocide in the Indian subcontinent. It committed genocide against the Dutch. Incredible. This is like straight up Nazi white supremacist rewriting of history.
We have to hear him say that again because I want to make sure nobody thinks we misquoted what he just said. Here we go.
No, sadly, it has not. Not one. So despite what they may be claiming on Twitter tonight, the British Empire was more than just genocide. In fact, the British did not commit genocide, except arguably against the Dutch during the Boer War. The British did give the world the Magna Carta and habeas corpus and free speech. God. They helped end the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the ritual murder of widows in India. The British Empire spread Protestant Christianity to the entire world.
Oh my God.
It published some of the greatest literature ever written and produced the finest manufactured goods ever made anywhere
on so many levels, what Tucker Carlson said there is just completely absurd in every single way. First of all, we need to really understand that this is kind of like definitional fascism. Aimé Césaire, who was a revolutionary from Martinique, anti-colonialist revolutionary, he famously had this essay, Discourses on Colonialism, in which he argued, I think correctly, that fascism was the application of European colonialism internally. The British Empire committed genocide in numerous countries, especially the Indian subcontinent, also in Southern Africa. In the Indian subcontinent, in the case of the Bengal famine in 1943, at least 3 million people died in an intentional famine caused by the British Empire. It continued to export food from India while people were dying of famine. And what was the response of Winston Churchill? He said, "I hate Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion." It was an intentional genocide. You can't just ignore and rewrite that. And also, what's incredible is Tucker Carlson mentioned the Boer War. What he didn't mention is that the British Empire it used concentration camps in the Boer War in Southern Africa and massacred Africans, indigenous Africans. And the Nazis were inspired by the British Empire. That's where they got the idea of concentration camps from, along with the concentration camps that the US created for indigenous peoples while they were carrying out genocide and ethnic cleansing of indigenous nations. The Nazis were quite literally inspired by the US colonialists and the British colonialists. Tucker Carlson is praising the British Empire, claiming that the British Empire left India more prosperous. That is completely false. There is nothing in any way true about that. In fact, Rania, I know you have had on Prabhat Patnaik, one of the most renowned Indian economists, a brilliant economist, and he and his wife, Utsa Patnaik, published a book detailing how the British Empire stole $45 trillion of wealth from the Indian subcontinent. In fact, after nearly 200 years of British colonialism, when the British were finally forced out of India in 1947, they left India less developed than it was before, 200 years before, with lower literacy rates, with higher rates of poverty. I mean, they destroyed the countries that they became. They destroyed the region, and they also fueled the partition, which was extremely bloody, that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. And when Tucker Carlson says that the British built railroads and a train station, yeah, why did they build railroads? That's the only thing they built. They built it to extract resources. It wasn't Indians using the railroads. It was the British colonialists who would build roads and railroads to the places where they were stealing the resources, and then they would send it to the ports to export them. That's not infrastructure development. That is strictly for extraction. And he says, like, the British built like a train station in Bombay, which is now Mumbai, by the way, like as if the Indian, like, massive population of 1.4 billion people can't build train stations. This is straight up white supremacist propaganda. He is quite literally going back to the white man's burden. This is the exact same narrative that the British Empire used in the 19th century to justify its colonial conquest. And now we see this guy who has the most popular TV show in the United States. Let's not forget, this unabashed white supremacist, Tucker Carlson, he also referred to Iraqis as semi-literate primitive monkeys in order to justify the Iraq war that he now claims that he opposed. I mean, this is straight up white supremacist propaganda. And if we understand fascism as the application of European colonialism internally, that's what he's justifying here. I mean, Tucker Carlson is quite literally fascist propaganda. I mean, I don't throw that word. I try to be careful with the word fascist. I don't just call anyone I disagree with a fascist. Tucker Carlson is quite literally engaging in fascist propaganda here.
Oh, 100%. I mean, actually, that really shocked me. And to just let people know, that longer segment of his actually included denying that Africa was basically like hurt by colonialism as well. Just really like it's shocking stuff, but it also shouldn't be, given the kind of politics that Tucker Carlson has espoused like repeatedly. But the fact that this person has the most watched show on American cable news, yet we're the ones who get, suppressed by the algorithm. And it just shows that he doesn't actually pose a threat to the status quo. He actually is a force multiplier for it. Whereas it's never, the far right's always the one complaining about censorship, but it's actually not them who are being censored. It's people like us, and maybe every once in a while some far right loser. But the reason I think that that's definitely is important to talk about, but also in keeping with this conversation, because at this point, that's what Silicon Valley has become. It's become this arm of the state. YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, they all take their cues from the Pentagon. They label this Chinese and Russian affiliated media as disinformation, as propaganda, so that you're scared to watch it, but not the BBC and not the NPR. And certainly they don't do anything or say anything about literal genocide denial and fascism coming out of Fox News. Because again, that doesn't actually, just because Tucker Carlson every once in a while has some segment where he's against a war or against sanctions and this or that country, sandwiched in between his weird segments about the war on handshakes and how British colonial, there actually was a segment
and white genocide and great replacement theory and great
replacement theory. Just because he does that once in a while does not mean he's our friend. But just to move it back for a moment to the Russia-Ukraine situation, So we've censored all this Russian media, right? And then people get excited because Tucker's the one place to sometimes hear something that's maybe a little bit critical of NATO. But
because Tucker's argument is we shouldn't be waging war on Russia. We should be waging war on China, Iran, and Venezuela instead of Russia. Because Russia is white and Christian.
Exactly. So, but in the online space, even in the online space, a recent study found that like influential bots are actually driving a lot of the conversation related to Russia and Ukraine, specifically on Twitter. Something like more than 90% of the bots were found to be pro-Ukrainian, with fewer than 7% pro-Russian. This is like an academic study that I'll link to in the description. But the point of all that is, makes you wonder who's funding those bots. Not a surprising statistic to hear, given how much Russian media has been suppressed in a lot of parts of the world. You can't even see RT tweets in your timeline. But, I think that this speaks to the broader double standards. Like, we know the Gulf states, which are American allies. We know that NATO, we know that the US military, we know that the Israelis, they all manipulate the narrative through social media, specifically through using these Twitter bots. The Israelis literally have like this war room for their keyboard warriors, like a unit of keyboard warriors that do this for a living. Meanwhile, Venezuelans, Iranians, Russians, they're literally erased from the internet because of like where they live and the like whatever the politics they're espousing. I mean, you've actually reported on how like real people have been removed from the internet in Latin America because of this. So I'm curious if you can just speak to that, because I don't think, when we talk about the censorship, we often talk about it in the context of media, but it's actual people and entire countries being censored from the internet so that people in the West cannot see them. So we censor those who live inside, and then the algorithm uplifts and promotes the people in the diaspora who want to like destroy their home countries.
Yeah, absolutely. There actually have been 2 academic studies from mainstream institutions that were recently published that exposed these pro-Western disinformation campaigns on social media. One was published by the Stanford Internet Observatory, and it found a, quote, interconnected web of accounts that used, this is an exact quote from the study, used deceptive tactics to promote pro-Western narratives while opposing countries including Russia, China, and Iran. And there was another separate study that was conducted by the University of Adelaide, and it found that between 60 to 80% of accounts tweeting hashtags related to the war in Ukraine in the first 2 weeks of this new phase of the war. Of course, the war goes back to 2014. 14,000 Ukrainians died between 2014 and 2022, the end of 2021, before Russia invaded, although those 14,000 Ukrainian victims were erased by the media when Russia invaded. Anyway, the point is that this study found that in the first 2 weeks of the new phase of this war, in late February and early March, 90.16% of the accounts were pro-Ukrainian, 6.8% were pro-Russian. Over 90% were pro-Ukraine, less than 7% were pro-Russian. So this is concrete example from 2 very well-established, respected Western institutions, acknowledging that the vast majority of disinformation in social media is not actually from China and Russia. It's from the West. And we also see this thing, I'm sure you've seen NAFO, right? The North Atlantic Fellows Organization, which is like an attempt to like try to make NATO seem cool. It's like the most ridiculous astroturfed campaign. Like everyone knows it's fake.
Sounds like porn. I'm sorry. That name just also sounds like porn. Like, really, is anyone going to take that seriously, let alone think it's cool? Sorry, continue.
Yeah. And it's like, we've seen Ukrainian government institutions on Twitter praise NAFO. And we've seen the US Army's like info war arm, their like cyber warfare arm, also tweet in support of NAFO. It's so clearly completely inorganic. It's being coordinated by Western governments to spread propaganda and attack people like me and you. I mean, attack Western, journalists and people speaking out about this proxy war. And these are clear examples of concrete evidence of Western disinformation. Rania, you mentioned the Hasbara networks in Israel. That's quite literally, that's the name that they use. They're part of the IDF. The Israeli military has a Hasbara unit where they spread propaganda and information warfare and disinformation online. But that's all okay, according to the Silicon Valley corporations, because they're all contractors with the US government. I really need to stress this point because it's almost never acknowledged in mainstream corporate media, that Google, from its very earliest days, has always been a US government contractor. The journalist Yasha Levine has done brilliant research on this. He has a book on it called Surveillance Valley, showing how all these big tech corporations, although their leaders, their CEOs and executives portray themselves as like libertarians who pick themselves up by their bootstraps and they're completely independent. No,
utopian free speech warriors, free internet for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they are the actual welfare queens. It's not poor and working people who are welfare queens. Elon Musk has gotten billions of dollars of subsidies from the US government. And not just Elon Musk, all of these big tech billionaires and these big tech corporations, Silicon Valley. Google has billions of dollars of contracts with the CIA, with the Pentagon. Google was involved in mapping for the US military during the occupation of Iraq, in which 1 million Iraqis died. Also, we know that Facebook has large contracts with the US government, including the Department of Homeland Security. Google has contracts with numerous police departments and CBP involved in tracking undocumented immigrants. Twitter itself has contracts with the US government, with the Department of Homeland Security. Twitter also does paid advertising for US state media outlets like Voice of America, like Radio Free Asia, RFA. Mm-hmm. Twitter takes money from US state media outlets to spread propaganda against Iran and Venezuela and China and Russia, while banning Chinese and Russian and Iranian state media. And then among the accounts that are not banned, it labels them as state affiliated media. And of course, we all know that US state media, French state media, German state media, British state media, Australian state media, those outlets are not labeled. So it's just such clearly a double standard. And then people say, well, why does China, ban these media outlets or these social media platforms? Although, if you're using a VPN, it's very easy to use them in China. Mm-hmm. But it's because China understood the importance of what it called internet sovereignty. China created its own social media platforms because it understood that all of these Silicon Valley corporations are basically arms of the US government. When China does it, it's evil authoritarianism, big bad boogeyman. When the US does it, that's normal. It's just seen as normal. It's normalized. And then any other country that criticizes it, they're engaged in censorship and disinformation. It really shows these incredible double standards. When the imperial core does something, it's normal. When any country outside of the imperial core does something to challenge imperialism, that's seen as abnormal and crazy.
No, exactly. I think that's such a good way to put it. And they have to do this though. They have to do this to push for the wars they want. They have to control the narrative this way. They have no other choice because the outcome of these wars are actually terrible for people in the West. I won't say the Western ruling class, but for people in the West and Europe specifically. Like, I'm actually pretty stunned that Europe is doing what it's doing to itself. It's like slitting its own throat. They're talking about rationing electricity. You've got, like, I don't know if you saw, there was that, I don't have the clip with me, but there's that viral clip of that game show in the UK where like they spin the wheel for the contestant to try to get like a certain amount of his energy bills covered. In the US, you've talked about, I've seen you tweeting about this, Ben, how there's millions of people in the US who are actually behind on their utilities bills. In German industry, which is really like the bedrock of like Europe's industrial base, it's in Germany, is like on the brink of collapse because of the Russian gas shutoff. And this is, I'm going to quote from a recent Wall Street Journal article specifically about this. They say, the question is whether the current pain is temporary or marks the start of a new era of deindustrialization in Europe. The bloc has scoured the world for alternative gas supplies, striking deals to buy gas from the US, Qatar, and elsewhere. But the continent might never again have access to the cheap Russian gas that helped it compete with the resource-rich US and offset high labor costs, rigid employment rules, and stringent environmental regulations. And of course, this is speaking to the fact that Russia has cut off gas from the Nord Stream pipeline in retaliation, which is totally understandable, for Europe basically like launching an economic war on Russia by participating with the US in these sanctions that are an attempt to destroy the Russian economy. I don't know why on earth the European leadership thought that they could launch an economic war against their biggest gas supplier, but they did in service to US empire. And now it seems pretty like horrible what's happening in Europe. Like they're facing what seems like a definite recession, and their industries are like on the brink of collapse. So I guess, my question, and that speaks to why this disinformation is so necessary. Like the disinformation narrative, you need to be able to say to your public, as their livelihoods are being destroyed and their living standards are being destroyed, well, this isn't our fault. It's the fault of the Russians, and anything otherwise is disinformation. And I'm sure that you would agree with that. But I guess just to segue from that, Ben, why are the Europeans, do you think, willing to do this to themselves? Because the U.S. isn't really so hurt by this. The U.S., there's some ricochet effect on the economy and high gas prices. But in the short term, the U.S. doesn't depend on Russian gas. It has other sources. I think Russian gas was 3 to 5% of U.S. gas imports. So that, it's not so much for Europe. I think it was 30%, which is a lot. So anyways, why do you think the Europeans are destroying themselves for America like this?
Well, Ronnie, I think we really need to understand that this whole proxy war in Ukraine has always been about Europe. What we're really seeing is an attempt by the U.S. to prevent European integration with China and Russia. This is part of the U.S. Imperial project going back to the pivot to Asia in the first term of the Obama administration with the Hillary Clinton State Department. I mean, even if you go back earlier to the Project for the New American Century, these, neoconservative imperialists in Washington, they were always fixated on China. They understood that after throwing the Soviet Union, the U.S. also needed to overthrow the Communist Party of China. And so this is not necessarily a super new policy, but especially in the past few decades, as Europe integrated economically with China and also with Russia, especially in terms of energy resources, the U.S. was really trying to find a way to separate Europe, to keep Europe economically dependent on the U.S. instead. And the coup in Ukraine in 2014 led to Western sanctions on Russia. Let's not forget, Russia annexed Crimea after a democratic referendum in which over 90% of people in Crimea wanted to join Russia. And of course, that referendum, that annexation happened after the U.S. coup in Ukraine in 2014 overthrew the elected government, which was a neutral government in Ukraine, and installed a pro-Western regime that was viciously anti-Russian that started a civil war. And ironically, you can go back to 2008 when the current CIA director, William Burns, who was then U.S. ambassador to Russia, he wrote an embassy cable in which he warned, it was called Niet means Niet, no means no. And it's Russia's NATO red lines. And he warned that if Ukraine was added to NATO, it could start a civil war that could lead to a Russian intervention, which is, of course, exactly what happened. So anyway, fast forwarding now, the U.S. was using this conflict to try to keep Europe separate from Russia and also China and keep it dependent on the U.S. because the U.S. is trying to carve up the world right now and create a bipolar world to wage the new Cold War, right? And the U.S. is basically telling everyone, just like Bush said, you're either with us or you're against us. We are waging a war on Russia and China, and you have to pick a side. You can't be neutral in this. And what we see is that Europe, not only, involuntarily, there's a lot of people voluntarily who are just willing to join the U.S. camp very eagerly, right? There are a lot of anti-Russian and anti-Chinese hawks in Europe who are ideologically motivated, especially by this kind of imperialist mentality we were talking about earlier with the British Empire, this very condescending mentality, especially racism against Chinese people and even Russians who they see as not quite white. And if you go back before Russia invaded, we saw that the U.S. government was really heavily pressuring Germany to cut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which has been built. This, by the way, billions of dollars were invested from private companies. This is not like a state-owned German project. These are German companies that wanted to get access to cheap Russian gas because it's going to help them as capitalists, right? So what we're actually ironically seeing is that the German local capitalist class is actually having its own interests surrendered to the U.S. capitalist class, like this international financial capitalist class. You could separate, people used to talk about the small bourgeoisie versus the big bourgeoisie. And anyway, the point is that the U.S. was very heavily pressuring Germany to cut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was initiated not by Russia. It was Angela Merkel, right, who represented the German capitalist class. She was from the Christian Democratic Party, which is a centrist, center-right party. She was not a left-wing politician. And Angela Merkel wanted to create this gas pipeline. There's already another gas pipeline from Germany to Russia, which is Nord Stream 1. They created Nord Stream 2, and we saw that I mentioned Victoria Nuland, the third in command of the U.S. State Department. This is a neoconservative hawk. She helped orchestrate the coup in Ukraine in 2014. She was saying clearly, we want Germany to end the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, to not authenticate it, to not, there was a German regulator that was going through the process to give it its license. And the U.S. said we are trying to prevent that from happening. And then what happened is when Russia started putting its troops on its border with Ukraine, there was all this fear-mongering, and Russia demanded in November and December of 2021 written security guarantees from the U.S., NATO, and the EU. And they all said, screw you. They refused to give Russia any written security guarantees. And they were putting up all this pressure on Germany to not accredit the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And then, of course, Russia invaded, and then they said that they're never going to accredit the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So that was the end of that. But we need to keep in mind that this was a campaign that was going on for years before Russia even invaded. And then, of course, when Russia invaded, that was the moment at which the U.S. could force Europe to carry out all of these aggressive policies that it wanted Europe to carry out. And in order to understand this, I think we should actually look at a very revealing article that was published in the Washington Post. I mean, when they published this, it was actually pretty shocking to me because it's so honest, it's so blatant, and it's exactly what people like you and I have been saying, right? Anti-war voices, skeptics. This article in the Washington Post, it was first published in Bloomberg, but it was reprinted by the Washington Post. It's written by this guy, Hal Brands. Hal Brands previously worked for the Pentagon, and he's now the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's a complete neoconservative. He fancies himself like the new Henry Kissinger, as like this aspiring imperial strategist. And his article is titled, "Russia is Right. The U.S. is waging a proxy war in Ukraine." And he says that the war in Ukraine is a proxy war in which the world's most powerful military alliance, NATO, is using Ukraine as a battering ram against the Russian state. And later in this article, he boasts, if you want to go down, you can look up the quote, "Ukrainian forces are nothing if not committed." Ukrainian forces have been willing in many cases to fight to the last man. So those of us who were saying that NATO is fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, this guy, again, who worked for the Pentagon, who is a complete neocon, an imperial strategist, he actually is admitting it. And then look at the last line of this paragraph. He says, the Ukrainian government and its supporters have no intention of letting Moscow escape the trap. So this is very clearly, it's similar to the famous Afghan trap when the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan in the 1980s after the U.S. began arming and funding the Mujahideen to try to bring the Soviet Union into Afghanistan to wage a proxy war there. And we saw Hillary Clinton openly on TV make the same comparison to the Afghan proxy war against the Soviet Union. So I'm not saying it's not a one-to-one comparison. There are differences. In the case of the Afghanistan intervention, the people of Afghanistan had a socialist revolution, the Sour Revolution, and then they invited in the Soviet Union to defend their legitimate government. Obviously, Russia did violate international law by invading Ukraine. So I'm not saying that they're direct comparisons, but the point is that this guy is referring to it as a trap.
Yeah.
So this is how U.S. policymakers see the conflict. For them, it's all geopolitics. It's not about Ukraine. It's not about democracy. It's about advancing their own imperial interests and their own economic interests. And now we see Ukraine is quite literally selling itself to Wall Street. We saw that Zelensky opened the New York Stock Exchange and he announced $400 billion in contracts for Western corporations, mostly U.S. corporations, to exploit Ukraine. Ukraine has passed this brutal anti-labor legislation, basically making it illegal to form a union. So Ukrainians are suffering. It's horrible. I mean, thousands of Ukrainians are dying, and they're also conscripted, right? These are not people who are voluntarily fighting in many cases. I mean, some are, but they're conscripted and they're sacrificing their lives, and NATO is bleeding them to wage this war on Russia. As the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who is, of course, a Raytheon lobbyist, he was on the Raytheon board of directors until just before he became Secretary of Defense. He said the U.S. goal is to bleed Russia, but it's also to prevent Russia from economically integrating, prevent Europe from economically integrating with Russia and China.
Right, which is so natural geographically speaking. It actually would make way more sense for Europe to have an economic relationship closer to those who it can more easily trade with than like this place on the other side of the world. But no, those are all excellent points, especially the comparison to Afghanistan. Like you can go back and find so many quotes from US officials basically saying, as the media is reporting that we have to support the Afghan freedom fighters, we have to support the war for freedom in Afghanistan from the evil communist like Soviet dictatorship and the Soviets themselves. You also had US officials both openly and privately talking about this is because we want to bleed the Russians. We don't care what happens to Afghanistan. We don't care about the consequences for Afghanistan. And you know what? That is what, provoked the next 40 years of horrible destruction of this country. This wasn't like Afghanistan its path wasn't laid in stone to be where it is today. Afghanistan had a progressive reformist government that was in power that the US didn't care it destroyed, because whatever it took to take a country in Central Asia and use it against the Soviets, if it could. But anyways, with Ukraine, like it's the same thing applies. Those who believe that, our American weapons in America is in the West are trying to help Ukraine. They don't care about Ukraine. If they cared about Ukraine, they would have ended this war on several occasions when they had the opportunity to. Instead, they're trying to prolong it as much as possible. But just to like zoom out to the globe a little bit, Ben, I've talked to you about this before, but I want to. It can't be emphasized enough that this whole idea of, back to the issue of disinformation, the West has, I think, successfully brainwashed its own public into believing that this is a war that we're fighting for Ukrainian freedom and for democracy in the West against the evil Russians, which we've obviously talked about. That's not what's really going on here. But it's had a much more difficult time convincing the rest of the world, particularly the global South. But I mean, I would really say the rest of the world, because I think the majority of people live in the global South. And so I've now started to see a lot of articles like the one I'm about to share. This is the New York Times. The title is How Russian Propaganda is Reaching Beyond English Speakers. And it goes on to basically lament the fact that all this like disinformation industry stuff has been so focused on getting rid of Russian media inside the US and inside Europe that we've really neglected that the rest of the world, particularly the developing world, is being subjected to this horrible, horrible propaganda as well. And we need to help them. And I want to find this quote, which I wish I had already found. To save time from like trying to find it in this long, BS article, I'll just read the quote because I have it written down here. It's, well, this is an excerpt, right? While many languages are used on Facebook, more than 80% of its enforcement resources are in English. Quote, I think that is a form of bigotry, that the rest of the world should not be protected from the worst, most dangerous content in ways that English-speaking users should be. That's like one of the sort of disinformation experts that's being quoted in this article. But like, that's just wild to me, that censorship, that we're not censoring enough in other countries means it's a form of bigotry. Like, and this like desire to understand, or not even understand, there is no desire to understand, this view that the only reason countries in the global South could possibly not care about the West's interest in Ukraine, the only reason is because of propaganda from Russia. It can't possibly be because people in poor countries that have been ravaged by Western colonialism and imperialism just maybe don't have the bandwidth to care about a European war, or like maybe their skepticism about the Western narrative is tied to their own experiences with the West. I can at least speak to the situation where I live in Lebanon. Like even the most pro-American people here just don't really care because they're just kind of happy it's not happening in their country. That's like one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is actual support for Russia's invasion, which is like the kind of attitude you'll see from people who don't like America. So it's kind of just like Russia, stick it to them. And they want China to invade Taiwan. They want China to militarily take back Taiwan too. They would love to see that. That's an attitude that I think is quite prevalent in a lot of parts of the global South. But I'm curious your reaction to that mentality that I just spoke of from that article, but also since you're in Nicaragua, what's the attitude like there?
Yeah, well, in general, the vast majority of countries in the global South are neutral or, in some cases, as you said, on the side of Russia. It's a fact. We can look at the UN vote, for instance, at the beginning of this new phase of the conflict, and even many of the countries that voted to condemn the Russian invasion have actually later changed their policies. So even that vote that didn't reflect the current balance of power internationally. But even if you look at that vote, the majority of the global population was in countries that abstained or voted with Russia in that UN vote. Especially, of course, we're talking about China and India, each of which have 1.4 billion people. But also you can look at, huge populations in South Africa, in Brazil, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia. Like, it's really just sometimes shocking to me how, frankly, racist a lot of these media outlets are, and that they truly see the rest of the world outside of the North America and Europe to be basically irrelevant. I mean, we're talking about 85% of the global population live outside the so-called West. If you expand the West to, include North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, 85% of the global population is in what you could generally call the global South. And they're treated as if their opinions don't matter. And if they are acknowledged, as in this case, they're treated as simply people who are just automata who have their opinions because they watched RT one time, right? It's so condescending. And to see these imperialists in the US try to portray it as progressive, this is, this new tactic to try to rebrand US imperialism as progressive, and to say that it's bigotry to not have non-US government propaganda censored. That's essentially what they're saying. They're saying, we've censored all other perspectives on social media except from Western governments. So now we have to do that in all other languages, not only in English. That's what they're saying. And if you don't censor the perspective of people in China and Russia and India and Iran in their own languages, if you don't censor it, then that's bigotry. I mean, it really is. We were talking about the white man's burden earlier. What this is it's the new generation, the new rebranding of the white man's burden. It's the West is the civilized, democratic, part of the world, and they need to spread their democracy and human rights and media literacy to the rest of the world. And they ignore the fact that people in the global South have a very different view, for instance, of the Queen dying, where people in a lot of the global South were celebrating. Even in Argentina, which doesn't have a particularly, revolutionary political culture by any stretch of the imagination, a major Argentine TV host was celebrating on TV with champagne because Britain still has a colony right off the coast of Argentina, the Malvinas Islands, which Britain refers to as the Falkland Islands. So we can also look at speeches from you don't even need to look at speeches from revolutionary anti-imperialists. I mean, I could point those out for hours. If you listen to speeches from Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, from Díaz-Canel in Cuba, from Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, if you look at speeches from the Chinese government, clearly they take a more adversarial anti-imperialist line. And you asked about Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, Russia is very popular because during the 1980s, the Soviet Union supported the Sandinistas when the U.S. was supporting fascist Contra death squads who were burning down schools and hospitals and massacring civilians. Surprise, surprise. The U.S. invaded and militarily occupied Nicaragua 3 times. And then, of course, it has a history of sanctions. There are sanctions right now in Nicaragua. The U.S. backed a violent coup attempt against the Sandinista government in 2018. So obviously, the Nicaraguan population is very critical of the U.S. and very supportive of China and Russia because China and Russia support them and have helped them. And by the way, China and Nicaragua are on the verge of signing a free trade agreement And the U.S. is freaking out right now. And there's all this propaganda saying that like China is colonizing Nicaragua, all this nonsense. So, according to the country that quite literally invaded and militarily occupied Nicaragua 3 times. But anyway, but even if you look at the leaders of countries that don't have this very revolutionary anti-imperialist political tendency, South Africa is a good example. South Africa is a major economic and political power, and its government is not revolutionary, but it does have an anti-colonial tradition, of course, against apartheid, which was a legacy of colonialism, of Dutch colonialism, and going also back to British colonialism as well in Southern Africa. And, Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, the British colonialist. But anyway, the point is that if you look at the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who's not a leftist, even he gave a speech in his parliament saying that NATO started the war in Ukraine and NATO bears responsibility for the war in Ukraine. So this is not a revolutionary. This is not a socialist, an anti-imperialist. And yet the response of Western governments is, the president of South Africa apparently is repeating Russian disinformation. Apparently he's so stupid, he can't say anything except for what Russia RT tells him to say.
So unbelievably offensive. And so much of this also speaks to like the fear, the very real Western fear of a multipolar world. I mean, that's what the Cold War is all about. It's all about maintaining US hegemony over the world. It's the fear of the rise of China in particular. So, why is the US so terrified of multipolarity? I mean, I know that seems obvious, but it's a good question. And while we know multipolarity alone won't fix the world, which we've talked about before on various other programs, Ben, why is this an important opportunity for the Global South specifically as kind of like a tool towards sovereignty and independence?
Well, we need to understand that really the emergence of capitalism itself is directly, inextricably tied to European colonialism. Of course, it was the European colonialists and mercantilists who created capitalism. And it was Marx himself who wrote in Capital that the rosy dawn of capitalist accumulation was the hunting of Black people in Africa and the entombment in mines of the indigenous populations in the Americas. So acknowledging that the beginning of primitive accumulation of capitalism, that is the wealth that capitalism was based on, was stolen from the Global South through the enslavement of millions of Africans and the genocide of indigenous communities. So we need to understand that going back to the 15th century, this system of colonialism and later capitalism was predicated on the subjugation of the Global South by the Global North. But if you look at before the rise of European colonialism, Asia and also Africa, but especially Asia, being where a plurality of the global population is, 40% of global population in Asia, Asia was responsible for a significant a plurality of a global GDP, of global economic trade and business, right? You can go back even to the Silk Road, right? China is building a new Silk Road, but what about the old Silk Road? This idea that globalization is something that's new is ridiculous. European colonialists did not invent globalization. The Silk Road was globalization. When we talk about globalization today, people tend to use it to mean neoliberal globalization or imperialism. But imperialism and globalization are not exactly the same thing. They don't need to be the same thing, right? And the reality is that, even Jeffrey Sachs recently has been talking about this. He's a mainstream bourgeois economist. He's been talking about how if you go back to even the 18th century, and you look at the percentage of GDP that came from China and India before European colonization of China and India, it was near about half of global GDP. And then with the rise of European colonialism, we saw the de-development, not the development, the de-development of China and India by European colonialists, the exact opposite of what Tucker Carlson was saying, and the extraction of that wealth and sending it to the imperial core to develop the imperialist countries. But what we're seeing now is that there was a peak of anti-colonial struggles in the 50s, 60s, and 70s during the national liberation movements. That was the formal end to colonization. We saw the violent overthrow of the brutal genocidal French colonial regime in Algeria. The French colonialists killed over 1 million Algerians in the decolonization struggle. We saw the struggle against Belgian colonialism in the Congo, led by Patrice Lumumba, who was murdered by Belgian intelligence backed by the CIA. We saw, of course, the Cuban Revolution, the Korean Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. After 100 years of the century of humiliation, the 100 years of colonialism by the European colonialist powers. The point is that those glorious, very important national liberation struggles, they succeeded in formally ending colonization, but economically, they were still largely colonized by the colonialist powers. This leads to Nkrumah, who was the Ghanaian revolutionary leader, a socialist and Pan-Africanist who helped liberate Ghana from European colonialism. He wrote about neo-colonialism. And this was 60 years ago now when he was talking about neo-colonialism. And we've seen an attempt by countries in the global south to develop their economies so they don't have to be reliant on the IMF and the World Bank, these neo-colonial institutions. And I think what we've seen now is, the difference now with the rise of multipolarity is, one, there's a socialist pole led by China, which is fundamentally different from the capitalist imperialist multipolarity leading up to World War I and World War II, right? Or World War I specifically. In the lead up to World War I, yes, it was a multipolar world of different capitalist poles, imperialist poles, but there was no socialist power. The 1917 revolution in Russia led to the rise of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was trying to create, a more democratic world system. And then the U.S. imposed the first Cold War, right, which led to a bipolar world. There was a brief attempt to create a multipolar world through the non-aligned movement, right? That was an attempt to create a multipolar world, and it was led by other socialists. It was an attempt to create another socialist pole. I mentioned Nkrumah was involved from Ghana, also Nehru from India, who was a socialist, also Nasser from Egypt, who is a socialist. Most of the leaders of the non-aligned movement were different kinds of socialists, and they were trying to create a new, a third pole in the world, and that was largely defeated by imperialism. But anyway, the point is that what we're seeing now is that China, and to a lesser extent some other countries in the global south, have developed economically to a point that they no longer have to be completely economically dependent and reliant on the imperial core in the same way. They've been able to develop their productive forces and develop their own international policies, have their own foreign policy. Brazil is a good example of this, right? The BRIC system is an example of an attempt to create a kind of multipolarity from semi-peripheral countries that were part of the periphery of the imperialist world system, of the capitalist world system, but have been able to develop the productive forces of their economy to such a point that they're now semi-peripheral. And the good example of that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. We're now seeing the expansion of the BRIC system to include potentially Iran and Argentina. And essentially what we're seeing is that era of neo-colonialism, it's still not over, certainly. We see the attempt by the U.S. to reimpose its neo-colonial control over Latin America, invoking the Monroe Doctrine. Next year is the 200th anniversary of this colonialist Monroe Doctrine, and yet U.S. politicians continue to invoke it. In Europe, of course, we see the attempt to try to reimpose French imperialism in Africa. We see an attempt to bring back the British Empire, which is trying to rewrite the history of the British Empire. So this is, these are the European.
And just real quick, that's not to mention all of the various like NGO style systems that a lot of these countries are involved in. That's another. Anyways, you've written a lot about that, another arm of that sort of neo-colonialism. But I was thinking of the Germans in Lebanon. I can't let them go without a shout out. But anyways, continue.
Yeah, Germany has a lot of soft power in terms of the Stiftung, right? The foundation industrial complex. But anyway, the point is that I think what's fundamentally different about this era, and I don't want to be maybe too optimistic. It's still a very difficult moment. The Western imperialist powers are still very powerful. The U.S. in particular, U.S. hegemony is still very powerful. The economic and especially the military power of the U.S. are really unchallenged. But that said, I think what's different now is that we're seeing the rise again of countries in the global south. I talked about this on your podcast. This is the good example of the rise of the South, not the bad rise of the South in the case of it's the rise of the global South, right? in some ways a return to where the global South was for centuries and millennia before the rise of European colonialism. And I'm not saying that European colonialism is going to disappear in a few years or even a few decades. But what we are seeing is that if you look at the percentage of global GDP and the rise of economies in China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Philippines, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Ethiopia, these are massive countries with big populations that are educated, that want to develop their countries, that want to get out of poverty. And many of them are not socialists. They might be kind of nationalists who just want to develop their own country. Some of them are socialists, right? But what we're seeing is essentially an attempt to reimpose the European and US-led colonial order, and especially the US-led hegemonic order of unipolarity, but also incorporating European imperialism in, as a junior partner of the US-led empire. And that's why we see these proxy wars in Ethiopia. That's why they see this conflict to try to start a new war with China. We see these proxy conflicts in Latin America as well. And that's why the election in Brazil right now, coming out this October, is extremely important, because it's no longer the 19th century. The vast majority of the global population lives in the global South, 85% of the global population, and they are developing their countries, and they refuse to go back to being colonies.
Yeah, and no, that's the fear of multipolarity, is it gives space for those countries to have an alternative, that they don't have to be dependent on loans from like the US or from the Europeans. They can look to a country like China, which is like forgiving loans, as opposed to the sort of actual debt traps that the US financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank put them in. On that note, Ben, this was like an awesome conversation. I guess just to bring it full circle, obviously, everything you just described is why we need this disinformation industry of so-called experts to tell us what's true and what's not, because all of this is so obvious. And it makes so much sense. And if there was a cable news program, or if this was a cable news program that had as many viewers as Tucker Carlson, I think a lot of people would be listening to what you're saying and they would be like, oh yeah. And that's why you don't hear this on CNN, or definitely not MSNBC, and certainly not Fox News. But Ben, on that note, can you tell people where they can follow your excellent work?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Rania. People can find all my work at multipolarista.com. It's all on there. I also have links to videos and podcasts in addition to articles. So it's all there. And Rania, keep up the awesome work. You all at Breakthrough do amazing work. I think it's probably my favorite media outlet. I watch pretty much everything you all do. And you all deserve 5 times the audience that Tucker Carlson has. Unfortunately, the world we live in is very much a screwed up world, very unjust world. But, we're doing all we can to resist the media's hegemonic narratives. And I think Breakthrough is really at the front of that struggle.
Well, thank you. It's a completely mutual feeling. We feel the same way about Multipolarista. So for everybody who is watching, who wants to, this is a good time to say, support Breakthrough News, support Multipolarista. And Ben, thank you so much again. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest Breakthrough News content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.